it's your nerdy suburban farmer. I'm back with a video with the worms. In this video, I wanted to start by showing a side-by-side comparison of the regular totes. Now these are the 10-gallon totes, no holes at the bottom, only the holes on the lid. For the past 2 weeks, I've been giving them pretty wet feedings. And this week, when I open the bins, you'll notice that my worms are trying to make an escape. So when I see this, I take this as a definitive sign they're unhappy and it's probably just a little too damp. So I'm gonna add some cardboard into the bins along with their feeding, and I'm not gonna feed as large of a wet food source. They will break down the cardboard. They use that carbon source as a food, so it's not going to hurt them in any way that I'm not giving them as much food as I have been. I'm more interested in trying to take the moisture out of the bins versus giving them a large feeding. But from the looks of it, the bin itself is doing well. I've got a lot of sprouts in the bins. So in both bins, for the totes, the worms were all along the sides and in the lid. And generally just looking for different environment than what was being provided to them. Looking at bin number 3. Oh, this one's trying to go into a different bin. Looking at bin number 3, I don't see much cardboard at all in this one. And it's really muddy. It's way beyond what I like to have as a consistency. So I'm definitely going to be adding quite a bit of cardboard to this one to take all that moisture out. Oh, I do not like the consistency of this. But what I fed this bin last week, really all that's left of it is the seeds from the melons. Now, since I don't keep my worms separated by species, they're mostly all red wigglers, and I had thrown some night crawlers in. There's no issue for me to go between bin to bin because it's the same worms in each bin. If you have red wigglers and perionyx and night crawlers that you keep separately, you're going to want to make sure that you check your gloves to keep them separate, but I don't have that issue. But same bin conditions in this one. Really wet and muddy soil, which I am not a fan of. I like it just a bit drier than this. This one I have the aluminum foil to guide me as to where I filled the bin the last time. Not much of the same. It is pretty cool to see how things break down. This is all that's left from the melons, just the flesh. The rind's all gone. It's amazing what these worms can do in a week with food scraps. Still, the acorn squash is still here. They're getting into it. It's flaky now. But as I mentioned before, the drier stuff will take a while, but it will eventually break down. So I'm going to feed these bins and add cardboard to them. So I added in the cardboard and the food in this bin already. So with bin number 1, I'm going to do something different, and I'm going to cover this with just a screen instead of the actual lid, so that the bin can breathe a little more, and see if that helps dry it out. Again, it's summer and I'm in Jersey, so it's very humid, and that's what's causing the bin conditions. I'm gonna put the lid back on for now because there were a bunch of worms in the lid, but tomorrow I'm gonna take the lid off and then let it go with being open for a week or a few days and see how it dries out from there. All right, so onto my Vermi bag totes. I expect the conditions to be much drier in these. And there's not a bunch of worms crawling on the top or around the sides. There's just one, which you'll always get 1 or 2. But as many as the totes before, you shouldn't have that many. And the conditions in this tote, they're moist. It's a lot damper. And again, I attribute that to the wet feedings I've given for 2 weeks. So I'm gonna add, just some remnants of the food. So for this week, for this bin, I'm gonna do the same thing and just add a little bit of cardboard to the feeding, but instead of mixing it in, I'm going to add the cardboard to where I feed to and give them a smaller feeding so they can use the cardboard to sprout some of the remaining bits of food that are in here. If you leave a sticker on your fruit, it's okay. They just will compost around it, and then you can just pick it out or harvest it out when you sift. Now for this bin, since it is so wet, I am going to just fold up the bubble wrap instead of covering it all over to, again, give it the opportunity to dry out. But I know it's going to dry out because the totes do allow for moisture to escape. Since there are worms in the bubble wrap, I'm not going to take it out completely because I don't want to pick the worms out. So I'm just going to fold it up and leave it in here. So for the second tote, this was the tote that was the drier of the other 2. And on this one side that didn't have the cover, which was the wetter side the last week, it's holding moisture better. It's not as flaky, a little flaky on the edges, but not as flaky. But in the inside, the consistency is a lot better. So I'm happy to see that. When I mentioned the mango pits from the last week, this is a mango pit. They start to break down eventually, and you can peel them open. And I'll just give it back to the worms. Surprisingly, there's no worms in here. Usually you'll find a worm or 2. Look at this. This feels a lot better than it has in the past few weeks. So some bins get wetter and more moist, and this bin is regulating itself. Still some more of that acorn squash, and the worms are moving into it. But yeah, this one feels about the consistency I would like it to be. A little bit wetter would be okay, but this is a good consistency from the bone dry it was starting to feel like. So I still got some areas to work on, but since I fed over here, I'm gonna feed over this side this week. And I still see quite a few worms in here. So I'm not concerned about the worm colony at all. I see them crawling. I'm gonna give this one a little bit wetter of a feeding than the other ones. Still not a big feeding. And I'm not gonna add any cardboard to this one. There's no need to dry it out. I'm still trying to keep moisture in on this one. So it goes in line with all the other bins. The Vermibag Mini had some leachate. Now it's divided on what you can do with the liquid that comes out of the bag. I don't use the liquid that comes out of the bag at the bottom. Some people say it's great for your plants. I personally don't use it. It's not anything to be alarmed about if you do see the liquid come out of the bag. It just means the bag is wet. And since my totes were wet and my Vermibag tote was even wetter than it was the previous week, I expect this one to have a lot of moisture, given that I did give it a heavy feeding as well. It seems like the Vermibag the Vermibag Mini is the only one where I have the beetles. I didn't see many beetles in my other bag. Can you zoom in on that? And you see them. Again, the beetles aren't bad. It's not a problem. You're gonna have different pests in your bins at any given time. You just don't wanna be overrun in your worm colony with beetles versus worms, because then they compete. And just as I thought, this is wet. And that goes along with why I have a bunch of beetles. The wetter your conditions are, the more food that's in it, the more beetles you'll have. And I gave this 2 huge feedings. So just like with the other bins, I'm gonna cut back on the size of the feeding. But it's all promising because all my worms are at the top. So it's not a bad thing. I was successful in what I set out to do, bring the worms that were pushed down back to the top, into the feeding area. So I'm definitely going to give this some cardboard with the feeding to bring the level up a little bit higher again, and then to cut down on some of the beetles. I'm going to do a little bit more diatomaceous earth in this one. So for this, I'm going to sprinkle some of the diatomaceous earth on the top. It's also got neem cake in this, and it it helps reduce down the population of the beetles in here. So a good spreading of that. And then I'm going to put a layer of cardboard on the bottom. I'm gonna give it a smaller feeding than it's been getting. And I'm not gonna add any liquid. Normally I would just add the liquid that comes off after it's defrosted. I'm not gonna add any liquid to it. Another layer of the diatomaceous earth, neem cake, and eggshell. And then cover it with some more cardboard and newspaper. And then next week, we'll see how either leaving the lid off in the regular totes, leaving the bubble wrap off in the Vermibag tote, and adding additional cardboard helped dry out the bins. That concludes my worm video for today. I hope you found this interesting, and thank you for watching.